Colleagues, in closing, I must address another Russian attempt to play politics with the tragic situation in Gaza. The Chinese permanent representative said in his statement the need to avoid politicizing the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I agree completely. Russia continues to try to portray itself as a great humanitarian actor when it comes to Gaza, yet it does very little when it comes to trying to address the humanitarian situation. Nothing in the Russian permanent representative's statement referenced anything about what it's doing to help relieve the humanitarian situation. Let's not forget the humanitarian disaster it has created in Ukraine. As I've said many times, Russia doesn't help solve humanitarian crises, it creates them. So I call on the Russian representative to heed the call of his Chinese counterpart and stop playing politics with the situation in Gaza. Thank you.
The representative of the United States seems to really enjoy what he probably thinks are devastating invectives against Russia. And this time, he even invoked China as an ally, which at a different time, he never tires to ostracize on any pretext, which he considers merits that. And yet we are quite grateful to the representative of the United States for a clear demonstration of how a statement of a state that claims to have to be a responsible international actor, what it should not look like, and more specifically, a self-proclaimed coach of all international actors. If the United States spent for humanitarian aid in Gaza and other regions in need, even a small share of what they spend on supplies of weapons to hot spots, our world would be very different. Billions of dollars are spent for weapons to Israel, including $6.5 billion after the 7th of October, and tens of billions for Ukraine. Weapons which caused the death of thousands of Palestinians and Ukrainians. That is the real contribution of Washington. And if we speak of Gaza, the first thing that comes to mind is the completely pathetic project of the Sea Piers. This is really a masterpiece of kind of showcase architecture, which was basically washed away into the sea. As far as we understand, almost $300 million was spent on that piers. That's approximately the same amount that was declared to be in the form of humanitarian aid to Gaza throughout the whole year this year, through bilateral channels. But of course, we also recall containers with assistance that were airdropped, which caused the deaths of tens of Palestinians. All this was done instead of forcing Israel to abide by a ceasefire. Russia does provide humanitarian aid to Palestine through NGOs, through the government, and through the World Food Program. And the Palestinians are well aware of that. And overall, colleagues, just a friendly advice to you. Before giving lessons to everyone, at least pay up your contribution to the United Nations and stop causing a crisis of liquidity, which also hinders the humanitarian efforts of our organization. I now go back to my role as president of the Security Council, and I give the floor to the United States for an additional statement.
Colleagues, it's very interesting to hear the Russian Federation kind of belittle the humanitarian contributions that the United States gives around the world. We are one of the leaders, if not the leading single state contributor to humanitarian assistance. I'd be very interested to hear what Russia spends on humanitarian assistance as a percentage of its GDP. The United States is a lead player on humanitarian assistance around the globe. Russia is not. If Russia just spent 1% of what it is spending to carry out barbaric atrocities in Ukraine, then it could make a claim that it was doing something to solve humanitarian crises around the world. Russia is in no place to criticize the United States for what it does to humanitarian causes around the world. And I will repeat, Russia doesn't help solve humanitarian crises, it creates them. Look in Ukraine. Thank you.
I don't plan to continue this discussion. I'll just say very briefly, as representative of the Russian Federation, I'd like to know what percentage of GDP of the United States is represented by supplies of weapons around the world, which the United States delivers. And I just want to ask a question. I hope it's not a rhetorical one. When will you finally pay up your contribution to the United Nations budget? I now go back once again to my role as president, and I give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank you, Russia, Algeria, and China for convening this meeting. Allow me also to thank the briefers, and through them, the humanitarian community. Humanitarians in Palestine are trying to deliver on their noble mission in impossible circumstances and at the peril of their life. Our support should match their courage. UNRWA remains under attack. The baseless and shameless terrorism charge against a UN humanitarian agency are no longer a talking point, but a license to kill. The killing, maiming, and arrest of its staff members and the setting ablaze of its headquarters was a direct result of such incitement. The real target of Israel from this attack are the millions of Palestinians who rely on UNRWA to stay alive and to secure their most basic needs. Palestine, listen to the words leading humanitarian NGOs have said a few days ago, and I quote, "Our presence in Gaza is solely due to the unwavering commitment of our colleagues on the ground despite great risks to their own lives. Our continued presence should not be mistaken for a sign of something worthy of being called access. It is despite its very absence. The risks our colleagues are exposed to each moment are unacceptable. Today, the issue is not just a shrinking humanitarian space. There is hardly any space left to operate at all." End of quotation. These are the ones that should be supported and cheered, not those attacking them, not those killing innocent civilians and anyone trying to help them, rescue them, heal them, feed them, or simply report on their unjust and untimely death. We have collectively failed. This Council has failed. We can continue counting aid trucks and speaking of routes and imagining alternatives, but the only true measure of our success is our ability to alleviate human suffering. And the suffering of Palestinians is Israelis' goal and desire. Whatever solutions you come up with, it will continue ensuring they fail until it is forced to change course. And the first indispensable step is an immediate ceasefire. All of you are asking for a ceasefire, immediate one. Then I wonder, who is stopping you from implementing the ceasefire? If you tell me that the mighty Security Council, the 15 of you, including the permanent 5, who are saying that immediate ceasefire, are you going to prevail or allow the criminals to continue to prevail? Make up your mind. If you are the mighty Security Council, unable to control a violator of international law, a criminal killing tens of thousands of Palestinians, then you have to review your authority and your power. We have collectively, I said, failed. There is no speech that can convey the shouts of a child being amputated or dealing with severe burns, the silent agony of a father watching his child turning into bones before his eyes until all life leaves his body, the tears in a doctor's eyes as he counts the days and hours in lives he could not save, the anguish of a mother that has become the first and last line of defense after every shelter was destroyed. As we speak, refugees are running in the streets from one death to another as every school sheltering them has been bombed, as even tents were bombarded, with no regard for human life, for any rule of international law, for any sense of humanity. In a parallel world, Netanyahu stood before the US Congress and claimed Israel was not killing or starving Palestinians. Against all evidence, all logic, and any hint of human decency, his speech was the speech of a warmonger dedicated to the humanization of Palestinians and the denial of their rights. A speech of war, a speech of a person who is against peace. He said this was a clash between civilization and barbarism, as he was conducting barbaric attacks against a civilian population, using a lexicon you know well from the experiences of your own countries. It is the language used across history by colonial powers to justify their atrocities. This Israeli government demands you adhere to its supremacist views and be complicit with its crimes. Anyone who refuses this dictate is duped a terrorism supporter and an anti-Semite. But we will remain steadfast in our defense of humanity and international law, of freedom for the Palestinian people and peace for all, and know many will continue standing by our side in these halls and across the globe, and we are grateful for this support. Mr. President, Vice President Harris is now being criticized by unanimous Israeli sources for speaking the compassion about Palestinian victims. She stated, and I quote, What has happened in Gaza over the past 9 months is devastating. The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent. We reiterate here our support for Resolution 2735 and the need to ensure its immediate and full implementation. We need to put an end to this horrific assault and make sure such tragedy never occurs again by sparing no effort to achieve freedom and peace, as both of them go hand in hand. We also express our appreciation to the efforts of China for helping us to put our house in order. In this connection, we also thank Egypt, Algeria, Russia, and many others in this regard. Mr. President, the highest court in the world has concluded that Israel's occupation is illegal and must be brought to an end as rapidly as possible. The ICJ has provided us with its authoritative interpretation of binding rules of international law and spelled out Israel's obligations as well as the obligations of all states and the United Nations. The judges have delivered on their sacred mandate. Now it is time for all states and the UN to perform theirs. We will not ignore a single element that the ICJ articulated in its historic advisory opinion. We will seek the implementation of every detail about this illegal, unlawful, criminal acts against our people by the continuation of this occupation that has to end and end as soon as possible. In the coming weeks, we will act within the General Assembly and the Security Council to ensure this opinion is fully upheld towards a more just, free, and secure Middle East. Life, liberty, human dignity must prevail, and for the international law must be upheld as well. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Palestine for their statement. I now give the floor to Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. What an absurdity to again be called to this council to again discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, especially when this council has failed to hold one single session on the real reasons behind this terrible war, behind the horrific attack on October 7th. The Council should be discussing Hamas, a word that I didn't hear from my colleague. He doesn't know that they exist, and its destructive and barbaric agenda to destroy Israel, public agenda, orchestrated by Iran. Iran's intentions are to destroy the Israeli people using currently their terror proxies, in the future also their nuclear capabilities. While we sit here, our hostages are still held in Gaza in the hands of Hamas. Just this week, our forces rescued 5 hostage bodies from a terror tunnel. Where? In a humanitarian zone. Yeah, you heard correctly. Hostage bodies in a humanitarian zone. And yet, there has not been one meeting, formal meeting, in this council, not on what started the war, and not even to discuss ways to advance the release of the hostages, not even one formal meeting. This fact disgraces the council. Colleagues, Israel is and will always be committed to our extensive humanitarian efforts in the Gaza Strip. When earnestly examining the facts at hand, you will see the immense lengths to which Israel has gone to protect civilian lives. Do you think a country which wants to harm civilians would allow 828,000 tons of aid to enter the Strip? Not from the Egyptian border only, from our borders also. Would such a country permit over 42,000 trucks to enter via land routes, 9,931 pallets of aerial drops, and 432 trucks through the maritime route? It is the State of Israel which organized and facilitated this aid, all while under a massive attacks from Hamas on our own forces, while we facilitate the enter of this aid. We continue to work tirelessly with our international partners to support the people of Gaza. We have facilitated direct and around-the-clock contact between the UN, the IDF Southern Command, and COGAT. But you didn't bother to visit, of course, our side and see the efforts, only the Egyptian side. 11 field hospitals have been established thus far, with 3 under construction. Since October 7th, Israel has consistently ushered in food, water, fuel, medical supplies, and other essentials. Israel stands ready to provide further support. And to those who falsely and maliciously claim that Israel has prevented the provision of aid, the real numbers show that of the 42,000 aid trucks, less than 1% have been refused entry since October, and only for security reasons. But of course, the UN representatives are only focused on and amplify this 1%. At the same time, the UN finds itself overwhelmed by the aid being provided, which it is unable to distribute because of UN's problems. The failure to distribute the aid is the main reason for the bottleneck. Why is this not the topic of today's discussion? While Israel meets its obligations, the world is being fed casualty numbers and data by the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health. How can we even hold a session on the situation in Gaza without verifiable data? Why hasn't the Security Council called a meeting to ask the UN for an independent process to secure reputable information rather than trusting the words of child killers and rapists? Not only does the UN falter in its duties to coordinate aid distribution, but its agency, UNRWA, is complicit in the perpetuation of this conflict. We have provided Commissioner Lazzarini more than 100 names and military IDs of terrorist operatives currently employed by UNRWA in Gaza. You pay their salaries here. This list is part of an ongoing process and does not yet reveal the full extent of the infiltration of UNRWA by the Hamas terrorists. Why has UNRWA failed to terminate, up until today, these terrorist employees? We have also discovered numerous UNRWA facilities and headquarters used by Hamas to provide humanitarian cover for their crimes. You like to call them schools. Hamas tunnels and weapons warehouses were found under 30 UNRWA schools. How can you claim that these facilities are entitled to protection? Why are we not here discussing the desecration of these schools by Hamas and UNRWA? Why has this never been discussed? Never. Why doesn't the Security Council invite an international law expert to brief this council that a school used for terror has lost its protection under international law? Probably if you invite one, you'll invite a Palestinian legal expert, I assume. Hamas has twisted much of the aid intended for civilians into weapons of war. Where we see a water pipe, Hamas sees a rocket. Where we see a hospital, Hamas sees a headquarters. Where we see a school, Hamas sees terror tunnels. On October 7th, terrorists invaded our homes, raping, murdering, and kidnapping our civilians. May I remind you again, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip 19 years ago. Today, Hamas terrorists continue to strike Israeli villages from designated humanitarian zones. Hezbollah rains down thousands of rockets and UAVs upon our north, burning town after town. Still, we have 100,000 Israelis that were displaced from their northern communities. And just last week, the Houthis struck Tel Aviv after more than 200 attacks since October 7th. You call it clashes. Until you address the head of the snake in Tehran, there is no way to bring stability to the region. Only a blind person or someone with a political agenda would not see this as a coordinated attack by proscribed terror groups to terrorize our citizens. Every single one of you knows that the reaction to this attack would look, how this attack, the reaction would look like if it targeted Moscow, London, Beijing, Paris, or Washington instead of Israel. Mr. President, 115 hostages are still held captive by Hamas Nazis. The most crucial element for the end of this conflict has been excluded from this conversation. And it's not enough to remind their existence as a footnote. We cannot simply stand by as our men, women, and children remain at the mercy of these mutilators. Again, where is the meeting demanding the return of our hostages? Without their immediate and unconditional release, there is no hope for peace and security. When the brutalities of Iran and its proxies are dismissed, Israel must take its future into its own hands. We will continue to carry out the necessary operations to defeat Hamas, along with anyone who attacks our citizens. Ultimately, Israel remains committed to providing life-saving aid to Gaza, while Hamas only remains committed to destroying lives. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Deputy Commissioner General of UNRWA, Ms. Antonia Marie de Meo, and the Humanitarian Coordinator in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, Mr. Mohamed Handi. We thank them for detailed briefings and the objective assessment of the situation on the ground. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip continues catastrophic. After 300 days, one of the most densely areas in the world, out of that basically nothing remains, and the number of civilian victims is staggering. Almost 40,000 people killed and more than 90,000 wounded, two-thirds of them women and children. More than 50,000 bombs were dropped on the enclave. The housing stock is destroyed, as well as the civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools. The people in Gaza basically have no food, water, or medicine, to say nothing about basic hygiene. Wastewater is flooding the streets. There's rubble everywhere and unexploded ordnance. Those who survived the bombings and shellings have to continuously move around Gaza looking for shelter and safety. Some Palestinians, including those who have children, are changing their place of shelter for the 10th time. And once again, they end up under Israeli shelling because there are no safe places in Gaza left. Eyewitnesses of this, UN staff and humanitarians, all as one confirm this. And many of them confess that in their entire lives they haven't seen such horror, such suffering that an entire people is facing. And so far, unfortunately, there is no hope that these sufferings will end in the near future. Worse than that, one American reporter who spent a month in Gaza saw even that their snipers targeting children specifically. This is what you get from rhetoric stating that every Palestinian as of 3 years of age is a terrorist already. And this is something that we heard from some Israeli ministers at the initial stages of the conflict. Nor are we filled with optimism from the recent data from Han Yunis about those who died, wounded, and yet another evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people. There is a continued great risk of the confrontation spreading to beyond this strip to Lebanon and Syria. Other groups are becoming involved in the confrontation. The Houthis, for example, who delivered such a serious strike into Tel Aviv on the 19th July. We're also concerned of the fact that there is a low level of humanitarian response, and we probably shouldn't have expected anything else in the absence of a ceasefire. As a result of that, all of the humanitarian resolutions of the Council remain word on paper. The special mechanism on humanitarian supplies created under Security Council Resolution 2020 obviously is not bringing in any significant outcomes. The attempt to have a corridor between Cyprus and the floating pier has failed. The pier was designed for river conditions and it was simply washed out into the sea. The Rafah crossing, through which significant volumes of humanitarian supply used to be delivered, is closed. The roads through which supplies are to be delivered are destroyed. As far as we can tell, the Israeli authorities continue impeding humanitarian supplies. There is insufficient financing, and people who are locked in Gaza can only hope for external assistance because there is no manufacturing in the Gaza anymore, nor is there agriculture. The deconflicting and the proverbial notifications in the course of active hostilities are clearly not working either. And that's why we get such tragic high figures. 278 humanitarians died. Out of them, 197 used to be UNRWA staff. On the 21st of July, yet another humanitarian convoy into Gaza was shelled. And that's just the humanitarians. The victims are also to be counted amongst the reported. 170 died. The healthcare workers, 500 people. It is the time to sound the alarm bell and to do it regularly. That's why it's difficult for us to understand why some of the Western colleagues on the Council are bashfully sidestepping what is happening in Gaza and prefer convening meetings on other much less urgent topics. And this is not something that does do them honor at all. What is also at an impasse is an attempt to arrive at settlement because of the disregard or insufficient attention to the interest of one of the conflicting parties. The Biden plan remains on paper, and we warned about that during voting on Resolution 2735. It became a spoiler of a kind and allows Israel, the United States, to contain any attempts by the Security Council members to raise another issues of another outcome of the Council, which would demand an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. We are also very concerned by a continued disinformation campaign about UNRWA. As far as we understand, the most disreputable allegations by Israel about UNRWA staff were not confirmed, whereas the conclusions by the group of experts headed by Ms. Colonna confirmed that UNRWA is in line with the principle of neutrality and plays a key role in providing assistance to the Palestinians. Members of the Security Council should not play along with the attempts to discredit the agency. We call upon everyone to rise up in its defense. There is no alternative to UNRWA, and this understanding should be the starting point of the Council's efforts. Draft Knesset resolution aiming to ban UNRWA in West Jerusalem and acknowledging the agency as a terrorist organization can only be interpreted as a slap delivered to the entire United Nations. We call on Israeli authorities to uphold the norms of international humanitarian law and to bear full responsibility for the people under occupation. I refer to, first of all, to the obligations to ensure food supply, health care, and public law and order. What also needs to happen is the halt to the settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. It is an egregious violation of international law. It is because of such actions by the Israeli authorities we notice that recently there's been an intensification the situation in the West Bank. It's now nearing an explosion point. We have stated on several occasions at the same time that we're against violence and terrorism in all of its manifestations, against attacks against peaceful civilians any place, in any country. This applies also, of course, to attacks on Israel on the 7th of October 2023, which we unconditionally and immediately condemned. There is no justification for this. But what is happening in Gaza can only be called a collective punishment and an attempt to totally eliminate the civilian population. Israel, of course, does have the right to ensure its security, but the path towards that goal, with any doubt, is only through a comprehensive Middle East settlement, and first and foremost, through rectifying historic injustice against Palestine and through creating an independent Palestinian state in line with the Security Council and General Assembly decisions. Any other questionable mechanism to reconcile Israel with its neighbors without just resolution of the Palestinian issue will not bring us to this goal and can only provoke outbursts of violence similar to what the region is living through now. Distinguished colleagues, what we need to do now is pool our efforts in support of just Israeli-Palestinian settlement on the basis of the international legal basis endorsed by the Council, and ensuring that would finally improve the situation in the region. There should be no monopolization of the mediation efforts, which we have been seeing recently in U.S. action, nor should it be a competition amongst main actors. All aspects is important. All effort in the initiative is of import. And in this context, we welcome what was arrived at recently in the Chinese capital, the understanding that is between the representative of Fatah and Hamas, which crowned a whole slew of preparatory meetings, including in Moscow. Palestinian Union is a guarantee that the interests of the Palestinian people will not be ignored once again. We expect that this success will have a positive impact on the ongoing negotiations on the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, which should finally lead to the ceasefire the people of Gaza need so much.